The deal was struck not with a ring, but with the weary nod of her father's head. At just 18, Clara was the payment for a debt. Her innocence traded for a plot of land. She was handed over to Elias Thorne, a hardened, widowed rancher whose heart was as barren as the dust bowl he worked. Her new life came with 3 motherless children and the cold silence of a man twice her age. The townsfolk whispered, placing bets on how long the fragile girl would last before breaking. But on that desolate ranch, something no one anticipated began to unfold. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wagon wheel groaned a final, mournful complaint as it settled into the dust of the Thorne Ranch, a sound that seemed to be the only welcome Clara would receive. This place was not a home. It was an ending. The land stretched out before her, a canvas of brown and ochre, cracked and thirsty under a sun that offered no warmth, only a bleached-out, indifferent glare. The house itself slumped like a tired old man, its paint peeling back in sun-scorched strips to reveal the gray, weary wood beneath. A garden bed by the porch held only the skeletal remains of forgotten flowers, their brittle stalks clawing at the air. This, Clara thought, was a place where things came to die. And then, he was there. Elias Thorne did not walk so much as appear, a tall, silent figure detaching himself from the shadows of the porch. He was carved from the same hard earth as his land, his face a roadmap of sorrows she couldn't begin to fathom, his eyes the color of a stormy sky just before the rain refuses to fall. There was no greeting, no nod of acknowledgement, not even a flicker of curiosity for the girl who was now, by some cruel bargain, his. He simply looked past her, at her meager belongings in the back of the wagon, and uttered his first words to her, his voice a low rumble of gravel and disuse. "Your room is upstairs. End of the hall." He turned without waiting for a reply, the screen door sighing shut behind him, leaving her to the silence and the dust. Inside, the gloom was thick, tasting of ash and old grief. A layer of fine grit covered everything, a shroud over a life that had stopped breathing long ago. The air was heavy with the palpable absence of the woman who had come before her. It was in the cold, black maw of the hearth, in the faded outline on the wall where a picture once hung, in the stifling quiet that clung to the very air she was now forced to breathe. And from that quiet, they emerged. 3 small figures, materializing from the deeper shadows of the room like wary spirits. The eldest, a boy of perhaps 10, stood with his arms crossed, his gaze a burning, defiant accusation. He was Samuel. She knew his name, but in his eyes, she had none. She was only an intruder, a replacement he would never accept. Beside him, a girl, Sarah, thinner and paler, simply stared, her eyes wide and vacant, as if looking through Clara at a ghost only she could see. And hiding behind them both, clutching a fistful of her sister's worn dress, was the youngest, Lily, a tiny thing whose fear was so profound it seemed to have stolen her voice. They said nothing. They did not move. They simply watched her, a silent tribunal passing a sentence that had been decided long before she ever arrived. This was her new family. This oppressive, suffocating silence was her new life. Clara's initial days bled into one another, each dawn painting the sky in shades of gray and rose that promised a beauty the ranch itself refused to acknowledge. Her life quickly became a lonely struggle waged against the twin tyrants of silence and dust. She learned that silence in this house was not an absence of sound, but an active, oppressive presence, a weight that muted the birdsong outside and magnified the creak of a floorboard into a startling intrusion. She resolved that if she was to be a prisoner, her cell would at least be clean. With a desperate, focused energy, she began her campaign to impose order and warmth on the house, a solitary battle to scrub away the visible layers of grief that clung to every surface. It was a war fought on multiple fronts. She beat the heavy wool rugs outside, sending up choking clouds of dust that seemed to hold the forgotten memories of a happier time, watching them dissipate like ghosts into the indifferent air. She spent an entire day scouring the soot-blackened stone of the hearth, her arms aching as she chipped away at years of accumulated ash, imagining she was clearing a space for a warmth that might one day return. She washed the grime from the windows until the harsh sunlight could finally pierce the gloom, illuminating the millions of dancing dust motes she could never fully conquer. Her campaign extended to the senses. She cooked, filling the oppressive quiet with the foreign sense of baking bread and stewing meat. Simple offerings meant to prove she was a presence, a living, breathing thing in this tomb of a home. But all her efforts were met with a profound and chilling void. Elias would move through a newly cleaned room without a flicker of notice. His cold indifference, a wall she could not breach. He would eat the hot food she prepared without a single word of thanks, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls, chewing with a mechanical detachment that made her feel more invisible than ever. The children, taking their cue from him, perfected their own quiet rebellion. A campaign of small, deliberate cruelties led by Samuel. After she spent an entire morning on her hands and knees scrubbing the sticky residue of neglect from the pine floors, he would walk in from the yard, his boots thick with mud, and trace a deliberate, unhurried path directly across her work, his dark eyes burning with a silent, hateful defiance that was far louder than any shout. Sarah perfected the art of looking through her gaze sliding past as if Clara were made of glass, while little Lily would physically flinch if Clara's dress brushed against her. A tiny, sharp rejection that stung more than any insult. This crushing isolation was a constant pressure that tested her spirit, wearing it down day by silent day. In the deepest hours of the night, alone in her small, cold room, she would hear the pitying whispers of the townsfolk echo in her mind, their words now feeling like a prophecy of her failure she was powerless to stop. The slow-burn pacing of her days, each one an exact copy of the last, created a tense, emotional tone within her own heart, a constant thrum of despair that whispered she wasn't just cleaning a house, she was slowly being erased by it. The silence of the house was not a peaceful thing. It was a brittle, tense entity that shattered completely, not with a word, but with a sound, a small, pained whimper that cut through the dead of night and sliced directly into Clara's sleep. The breakthrough in the oppressive quiet came not with words, but with the raw, desperate action of a crisis. In moments, she was out of her cot and down the hall, drawn by the sound to the children's room. She found the youngest, Lily, gripped by a dangerous fever, her small body radiating a terrifying heat while violent tremors racked her frame. Her sheets were soaked through, and her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. Beside the bed, Sarah stood as a pillar of mute panic, her thin frame rigid with fear, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. Samuel's carefully constructed bravado had vanished entirely, leaving only a frightened little boy in its place, his face pale and his hands clenched into useless fists. It was then that Elias appeared in the doorway, an oil lamp held aloft, the flame casting long, dancing shadows that made the small room feel vast and menacing. For a fleeting moment, Clara saw the father, the protector, emerge in his posture. But then his eyes fell upon the feverish child in the bed, and a ghost of a memory seemed to pass over his face, stealing his strength and his will. He was frozen, his knuckles white on the lamp handle, clearly trapped in the suffocating memory of his wife's final illness, a silent prisoner of a past grief that rendered him useless in the present. He was seeing not just one sick child, but two lost lives. It was in that moment of his paralysis that Clara moved. An instinct she didn't know she possessed took over, a fierce, primal urge to nurture and protect that pushed her past the statue of a man in the doorway and toward the suffering child. While he remained haunted by death, she chose to fight for life. All through the long, dark hours of the night, Clara worked tirelessly, a quiet whirlwind of purposeful motion. She dispatched Samuel for fresh, cold water from the well and sent Sarah for clean rags, giving their trembling hands and terrified minds a task to focus on, a small anchor in the storm of their fear. She drew on the half-forgotten knowledge passed down from her mother, using folk remedies brewed from the herbs she had found growing wild behind the barn. The sharp, medicinal scent of yarrow and boiled willow bark soon filled the small room as she gently coaxed the steaming, bitter tea past Lily's dry lips and continuously sponged her burning skin with cool water. Every time she looked up from the child's bedside, a film of sweat on her own brow, he was still there. Elias watched from the doorway, a silent, unmoving sentinel caught between two worlds, his face a mask of conflicting agonies. He was witnessing a strength he hadn't expected, a fierce, unwavering maternal tenderness that asked for nothing and gave everything. As the first pale gray light of dawn threatened the eastern horizon, the fever finally broke. The tremors ceased, and Lily's breathing deepened into a peaceful rhythm, her forehead finally cool to the touch. Clara slumped in her chair, her body drained but her spirit victorious. When she dared to look to the doorway again, Elias was still there, but the ghost was gone. In his eyes, she saw the first stirrings of a forgotten emotion, a flicker of awe that was the first true crack in the endless ice. The fever had taken the coldness from the house with it, leaving behind a tentative warmth in its wake. In the days that followed Lily's recovery, a fragile trust was sown, taking root in the smallest of gestures. Lily, once a fearful shadow, was now a constant, warm presence at Clara's side. Her small hand instinctively finding Clara's, as if anchoring herself to the person who had pulled her back from the brink. The true shift, however, came from the one who had been lost in the middle. One afternoon, as Clara mended a shirt, Sarah approached her, holding out a wildflower she had found, its petals a shocking slash of purple against the brown landscape. In a voice thin from disuse, Sarah begins speaking to Clara, whispering the flower's name. In that quiet, momentous exchange, as Clara gently asked the girl to write the word, she discovered the children are illiterate, their minds a fertile but fallow ground that no one had ever thought to cultivate. There were no primers, no slates, only the heavy, leather-bound family Bible that sat collecting dust on a high shelf. Looking at the eager, curious face of Sarah and the trusting eyes of Lily, Clara felt a shift within herself. She begins teaching them, creating a new purpose for herself beyond a wife in name only one. Their classroom was the rough-hewn kitchen table. Their ink was flour spread thin across the wood, their only textbook the Bible from which she patiently helped them trace the strange, powerful shapes of letters. Samuel, ever watchful, pretended to ignore the lessons, whittling a stick by the hearth with exaggerated indifference, yet his eyes would occasionally drift to the table, lingering on a newly formed word. Elias, too, became a silent observer of this new daily ritual. He would pause in the doorway on his way in from the fields, his gaze falling on the three heads bent together in concentration, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He never spoke of it, but his silent acquiescence was permission enough. This patient nurturing was a direct contrast to the harshness of her surroundings and became an emotional metaphor for healing the family too. Outside, the wind scoured the dry earth and the sun beat down without mercy. But inside this small circle of lamplight, Clara was cultivating something precious. Each new letter Sarah learned to write, each word Lily haltingly sounded out, was a seed planted in barren ground, a quiet, defiant act of hope that promised a harvest no one, least of all her, could have ever predicted. It was in the deep, humming quiet of a late afternoon, a time when the sun slanted low and filled the house with long shadows, that Clara finally came face to face with the ghost she had been living with. While searching for spare linens in a little-used storage room, she opened a heavy cedar chest, releasing the faint, bittersweet scent of dried lavender and thyme itself. Tucked away at the very bottom, carefully wrapped in yellowed muslin, was a dress. The fabric was a faded cornflower blue, worn thin and soft with countless cycles of work and wear. With love, it was the ghost of a vibrant color it once was, a tangible piece of the woman whose absence had defined the entire homestead. Clara found the tattered dress of Elias's late wife, a small, delicate tear in the lace at the collar and a seam beginning to fray at the sleeve, and instead of seeing an object of sorrow to be hidden away again, she saw a memory worth preserving. She felt a connection not to the loss, but to the life that had been lived in that dress. With a reverence she didn't know she was capable of, she took it to her room and carefully mended it, her small, neat stitches a quiet act of respect for the woman she would never know. She was so lost in the gentle, meditative rhythm of her work that she didn't hear him enter the room until his voice, sharp and cracked with a pain that was almost a physical thing, lashed out at her. Samuel discovered this and stood in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into a raw, trembling fury as he accused her of trying to replace his mother. His words the desperate, cruelest weapons a grieving boy could wield. The needle froze in Clara's hand, and the silence that descended upon the room was thick and heavy with shock and hurt. The confrontation forced Elias, drawn from the barn by the unaccustomed sound of a child's raised voice, to finally intervene. He filled the doorway, his large frame blocking the light, his eyes taking in the entire terrible scene with a terrifying stillness. His son, trembling with a rage that was really just sorrow turned inside out. His daughters, peeking from behind him with wide, frightened eyes. And Clara, pale and stunned, the blue dress pooled in her lap like a fallen piece of the sky. The air was electric with unspoken history and unresolved pain. Elias moved slowly, deliberately, into the room. He walked past Clara and stopped before his son, placing a heavy, grounding hand on his shoulder, forcing the boy to look at him. The house held its breath, waiting for the verdict. When he finally spoke, his spare, impactful dialogue cut through the tension with the clean force of an axe splitting wood. "She's not erasing. She's mending." It was the first time he had ever truly acknowledged her as a positive force, a validation that landed with the weight of a benediction. The words weren't just for Samuel, they were for her, a shield against the accusation. The rage in Samuel's face crumbled, his defiant posture collapsing as a wave of pure, unadulterated grief washed over him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he wept, great, shuddering sobs of a boy who had lost his mother. In that moment, with Elias's hand on a sobbing son and his words hanging in the air, a profound and pivotal emotional resolution settled over the room, gently stitching together the frayed edges of their broken family. The fragile piece that had settled over the Thorn Ranch was as delicate as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. For a few weeks, a quiet, tentative harmony reigned, a rhythm built on the shared work of the day and the murmur of evening reading lessons. This harmony was shattered when a physical challenge arose that threatened the ranch's survival. The threat came in the form of a man named Jedediah Blackwood, a neighboring landowner whose greed was as vast and barren as his own overgrazed pastures. He appeared at their fence line one morning, flanked by two hard-faced men on horseback, his presence an immediate violation of their newfound peace. With an arrogant sneer, he declared that the creek, the very lifeblood of the Thorn property, was now his, according to a new survey he'd conveniently paid for himself. The dispute was sudden and absolute, a direct assault on their existence. Elias stood his ground, his face an unreadable mask of cold, contained fury, but he knew he was outmatched in manpower. A battle of bullets against 3 men would be a battle he would surely lose, leaving his children orphaned. The only way to fight was with the law, and that meant the conflict would force Elias to leave Clara and the children alone for several days. The county seat was a grueling 2-day ride each way, and he needed to file his own claim with the land agent before Blackwood could bribe his way to legal ownership. The story's rhythm began accelerating, the slow burn of emotional healing replaced by the urgent, frantic beat of impending danger. The night before he left, the house was filled with a tense, heavy silence, a stark contrast to the growing warmth they had come to know. On the morning of his departure, Elias spoke to Clara with a directness she had never heard from him before. He took the worn Winchester rifle from its place above the mantel and passed it to her, his calloused fingers briefly brushing hers in a touch that conveyed a world of unspoken meaning. "Bolt the door after dusk. Keep the lamp low. Samuel will help you with the livestock." His stormy eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw not the order of a master, but the desperate plea of a partner. "Keep them safe," he said, the 2 words a heavier burden than any she had ever known. Then he was gone, just a dwindling silhouette against the rising sun, leaving a profound and terrifying silence in his wake. The family's burgeoning unity was immediately put to the test. The quiet home transformed into a lonely outpost on a hostile frontier. With a resolve she didn't know she possessed, Clara gathered the children, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. She was no longer just their teacher, she was their protector. Samuel, his young face grim and older than his years, took the responsibility of watching the creek from the ridge, a solemn guard at his post. Sarah became the keeper of the house, her quiet nature now a source of watchful strength. As dusk bled across the sky that first night, the world outside the cabin walls seemed to shrink, filled with menacing shadows and the magnified sounds of the wild. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, was the sound of a threat drawing nearer. The second day of Elias's absence dawned heavy and still, the air thick with a tension that had been coiling tighter with every passing hour. Every sound was magnified, the nervous clucking of a hen, the distant cry of a hawk, each one a potential harbinger of the threat they knew was coming. Just as the sun reached its zenith, beating down with a merciless, white-hot intensity, the expected but dreaded escalation arrived. Jedediah Blackwood and his men no longer lingered at the fence line. They rode directly onto Thornland, their horses' hooves tearing at the dry, thirsty earth, as if to claim it by sheer force. The rival landowner appeared before the small cabin, a swaggering, malevolent presence intending to intimidate the defenseless family he believed he'd find. He dismounted with a grunt, his spurs jingling like a rattlesnake's warning, a cruel, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips as he surveyed the lonely homestead. He expected to find a terrified girl and her trembling brood, a family that would be easy to scare off with a few harsh words and a show of force. He did not expect Clara. She emerged from the house, the heavy Winchester held loosely in her hands, its barrel pointed safely at the ground. She moved with a purpose that seemed to add inches to her height, her face calm and her eyes clear of fear. Clara, showing a quiet resilience that belied her age, refused to be cowed. She met his mocking gaze without flinching, a silent, immovable object standing in the path of his greed. As Blackwood began his tirade of threats and condescension, his voice booming with false authority, the barn door creaked open, with Samuel unexpectedly standing by her side, holding an old pitchfork like a soldier's spear. The dynamic of the confrontation shifted. He was just a boy, and his weapon was a simple farm tool, but his stance was a defiant roar, a declaration that Clara was not alone. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound, but his eyes narrowed. The scene was not playing out as he had envisioned. He took a step toward the house, his hand gesturing dismissively. "Now you listen here, girl." But his words were cut short. Clara didn't raise the rifle. She didn't shout. She simply spoke, her voice cutting through the tense air with the clarity of a bell. "This is the Thorn Ranch. You are trespassing." There was no plea, no fear, only an unshakable statement of fact. She protected the homestead not with aggression, but with unyielding dignity, revealing her character's true strength. This quiet certainty was a weapon Blackwood had not anticipated. He had come prepared for hysterics, for begging, for a fight he could easily win. He did not know how to combat this woman-child's granite resolve. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. Frustrated, his power undermined by a force he couldn't comprehend, he spat a curse into the dust, mounted his horse, and with a final, empty threat to return, rode away, his blustering intimidation broken against a wall of quiet courage. Elias crested the final ridge just as dusk was settling, the purple and orange hues of the sky offering a beauty he was too tired to appreciate. The weariness of the long ride sat deep in his bones, but it was a dull ache compared to the turmoil in his mind, a chaotic mix of legal papers and the grim possibility of failure. He had spent days fighting a battle of words and laws, and he was prepared to return to the same hollowed-out silence he had left, to the same ghosts of grief that always waited for him in the shadows. But what he saw below made him pull his horse to a halt, his breath catching in his throat. A warm, steady light glowed from the cabin window, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. It wasn't a flickering, lonely light, but a full, life-affirming glow, a sign of life he had long forgotten to expect. He returned to a home that was not only secure but also utterly transformed. The change was more than just the light. As he drew closer, he heard the low, melodic murmur of a voice, the gentle, rising and falling cadence of a story being told. He dismounted and approached the door not with the heavy tread of a master, but with the cautious step of a visitor, unwilling to break the spell. Peering through the window, he saw a scene that struck him to his very core. Clara was at the table, the warm lamplight illuminating her serene face as she read from the heavy family Bible. Sarah and Lily were huddled close, their faces rapt with an attention that was both innocent and profound. By the hearth, Samuel was not sulking but sat with a focused intensity, carefully cleaning the Winchester rifle with a slow, deliberate competence, his posture that of a young soldier who had seen his duty and done it well. When the boy looked up and saw his father, he offered a short, sharp nod, not of childish deference, but of shared responsibility, a silent acknowledgement that passed between two men who had guarded the same fort. The girls rushed to him with happy cries, their small arms wrapping around his legs, but Elias saw how their eyes kept darting back to Clara, their orbits now centered on a new Sunday. It was in that moment he finally understood her true worth. He saw the newfound respect in his children's eyes for Clara, a reverence that they had given to no one since their mother. This girl, this payment for a debt, had faced down a threat he had left her with, and had forged his fractured children into a loyal, steadfast unit. She had not just defended his home, she had resurrected it. The emotional and physical distance between them seemed to dissolve in the warm, lamp-lit air. Without a word, Clara rose and set a plate for him at the head of the table, the place where he had taken every meal in solitary silence for years. He hesitated, the habit of his grief a powerful anchor, a familiar weight he was almost afraid to release. But then he looked at the hopeful faces of his children, and at the quiet invitation in Clara's eyes, and he moved. The simple act of him finally sharing a meal with her at the main table was a profound act of acceptance, a silent treaty that ended a long and bitter war. Across the table, he met her gaze, and a smile, the first true smile she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. Months later, as the seasons turned and the harsh sun began to soften its glare into a gentler, more forgiving light, Clara's father, Henry, made the journey he had been dreading since the day the deal was struck. He rode with a heart made of lead, each plodding hoofbeat of his horse a drumbeat counting down to the reckoning he felt he deserved. He was a man coming to witness the consequences of his own weakness, a pilgrimage of guilt to the site of his daughter's sacrifice. He had spent countless nights imagining what he would find, each vision worse than the last, fully expecting to see his daughter broken, a fragile wildflower wilted and crushed by the barren soil she'd been transplanted into. He braced himself for a hollow-eyed ghost, for the deadening silence of a spirit that had surrendered. The man who arrived at the Thorn Ranch was therefore utterly unprepared for the miracle he found. The first shock was the color. Instead of the monochrome palette of dust and despair he remembered, he found a thriving home, anchored by the impossible sight of a blooming garden where there was once only dust. A defiant patch of vibrant greens, sturdy squash vines, and the cheerful yellow faces of sunflowers stood as a testament to a will stronger than the unforgiving land. It was a splash of life so profound it seemed to mock his grim expectations. As he drew closer, a second impossibility reached him on the breeze, the clear, steady sound of his grandchildren reading aloud. He dismounted, his movements slow with a disbelief that bordered on vertigo, and followed the sound to the porch, where he saw Sarah, her finger tracing the words in a book, reading a story to a captivated Lily. He had come expecting the silence of neglect, and found instead the music of learning. He moved around the side of the house, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and confusion, drawn toward the barn. There he saw the final, most profound transformation. He witnessed Elias and Clara working together as partners, standing side by side mending a bridle. Their hands moved in an easy, familiar rhythm, their conversation a low murmur of equals discussing a shared task. He saw Elias pause, listen to a suggestion from Clara, and then nod, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. This was not the broken, silent tyrant of his memory. This was a man resurrected. When Clara finally saw him standing there, her face broke into a smile so radiant and full of life that it stole the air from his lungs. There was no trace of the sacrificial lamb, only the quiet strength of a woman who knew her own worth. As she called his name, and Elias turned to offer a firm, welcoming handshake, Henry realized the transaction had saved not just his own honor, but an entire family. The terrible bargain he had made had not been an ending, but a beginning, an act of unintentional grace that had allowed 4 broken souls and 1 lost girl to mend themselves into something whole. The story, in the end, culminates with the Thorn family's next visit to town for supplies. It had been the better part of a year since the townsfolk had seen them all together, and their arrival was an event that unfolded in cinematic slowness, drawing a curtain of silence across the dusty main street. Wagons stopped mid-turn, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer fell silent, and the women who had gathered by the general store, who had whispered and waited for Clara's demise, were stunned into a collective, gaping silence. They had authored a story of tragedy for the girl, a grim novella of a broken spirit and a wasted youth, and they had gathered, in a sense, to read its final, pitiful chapter. They had traded pitying glances and morbid predictions, certain that the Thorn Ranch was a place where hope went to die. But the family that rolled into their midst had torn that story to shreds. What the town saw first was Elias. He was no longer a ghost of a man, a walking shadow haunted by the wife he had buried. The stoop of grief was gone from his shoulders. He was standing tall on the buckboard, holding the reins with a steady hand, his eyes clear and focused. He was a man returned to the world of the living, a man who met their stares not with the hollowed-out gaze of a recluse, but with the quiet confidence of a patriarch. Then, they saw his children, not the feral, grieving sprites who hid from sight, but a boy and 2 girls, clean and smiling. Samuel sat beside his father, a quiet confidence in his posture, his eyes scanning the street with a protective watchfulness. In the back of the wagon, Sarah and Lily looked out at the town with bright, curious eyes, their hands held together, their faces alight with an innocence the town thought had been lost to them forever. And finally, the crowd's gaze fell upon the girl they had pitied. They saw Clara, and the sight was the most profound shock of all. She was not walking behind him as property, her eyes downcast in servitude. She was riding beside him as an equal, a partner in the life they were building, her head held high, meeting the stares of the crowd with a calm dignity that radiated a strength far beyond her years. The shocking outcome, the one that left everyone speechless, wasn't a dramatic tragedy or a midnight escape. It was the quiet, powerful miracle that unfolded before their very eyes. The miracle of a girl who, when given nothing but a broken man, 3 grieving children, and a patch of barren earth, had managed to patiently, lovingly, rebuild everything. She had not simply endured the terms of her bargain, she had rewritten them completely, transforming a payment of debt into an act of creation, proving that the most resilient things can grow in the most unlikely of places.